Okay, so I have different colors of, no, I don't. So you can either use a ruler or a straight edge. I happen to have this, what's this called?
It's a square.
It's a square. So this is an aluminum slat rod bar. Hi, I'm Jane Dunewald, and today I'm going to share the way that I face a piece of textile art with you because I think it's a really clean finish that is usable in lots of different circumstances. Now, in a previous video, and we'll put the link down below so that you can watch that one in case you haven't seen it yet, I took this piece of art, which is fabric that has been botanically printed, and I used a fusible web. Misty Fuse is my favorite. That's a heat-activated adhesive. And the heat-activated adhesive goes between the top layer and the back layer, in this case, this gray craft felt, and it glues them together when I iron it. In that other video, you'll see exactly how to do that. In any event, now I have created a backing for this piece that makes it nice and stable, so it will hang beautifully, and I am now to the stage of wanting to finish the edge. Now let's talk about that for a minute. For some pieces that are a little bit edgier or really contemporary in ways that are visual, I might not necessarily even add a facing to the edge. I might keep the clean cut edge because if I do, it won't unravel. There's no real reason this has to be faced. Now, I do think it's important to address the fact that sometimes it looks unfinished to an uneducated viewer eye. And in cases like that, I tend to choose to put a little straight stitch of machine stitching all the way around the piece because that sends the message that I made a conscious choice in the finishing that I chose. But that would be up to you. I've done it both ways. In this case, I definitely don't want to use what's usually called a binding, which is used for more traditional quilts. And in the case of a binding, there is a strip of fabric, like the gray fabric I have right here, and that's applied to the edges and encases the edges of the piece. But sometimes the binding is a bad idea, partly because it is such a traditional way of finishing a quilt, and then secondly because sometimes it saps the energy out of the piece visually because it contains it like a frame that is not really very welcome. So I don't want to make that choice for this piece. I want to do what I'm going to do, which is to face it. Now, when I face it, and I have done this edge so that you can see it in advance, although I know it's gray on gray and it's hard to see, the fact is that I chose this gray so it would blend into the felt, so it would be a really nice, even finish once the piece is completed. But what I'm using here, you see, is creating these strips, literally sewing them to the quilt, and then turning them to the back and stitching them down so that I have a nice, clean, finished edge that doesn't show. So let's jump into how I do that. Okay, so I choose this gray quilter's cotton, just a plain weave cotton, and I chose it because, as I said, it's the same color as the gray that I always use when I face my pieces. If you were using white felt or some other kind of a backing, you would choose your fabric based on whatever the backing looks like, okay? Now, in advance, I cut 2-inch strips of fabric, and they are a little bit longer than each of the edges that I'm planning to face. And I face the edges one at a time and I stitch them down. Okay, so basically before we went on camera, I folded this edge down and ironed it with the steam iron in order to get a nice crease. Now I'm going to pin this to the edge, and before I do that, I want to make sure I squared up the piece. Okay, I have this square and I'm going to use it to square it up. How about that? So I put it against, and I've done this already, but that's how you can double check to make sure you've got a nice straight edge, because if you don't, then your facing will be wonky later. Okay, now I'm going to use straight pins, and when I pin this down, you can see on this corner right here, I'm overhanging the piece by about 1.5 inches. That's because later I'm either going to trim it or I'm going to fold it in, and you'll see when we get to that point. I'm going to use these straight pins and just put a few pins to hold this in place. And when I get this all pinned, then I'm going to go to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch in, which means that the presser foot will actually be lined up with this edge for those of you who use sewing machines. And I'm going to do that off camera, but then I'll bring it back and I'm going to stitch it in white thread instead of gray thread so that you can see how I did the stitching. Okay, so now I've stitched it on the sewing machine and I used white thread so that you could see it. Typically I would use gray so that everything's matchy-matchy, but for the sake of the demo I did it this way. Now I'm going to take out the pins. And the first thing I'm going to do is use the iron to flatten it out. And then I'm going to turn it over. And now, starting on this corner, let me move it down so you can see it. In this case, I'm going to cut this extra off so it's nice and flush with the edge. If I was doing this last edge, I would leave it there and fold it in. Now I'm going to fold this up and finger press it a little bit, but I do have to work with the iron now. And I'm going to try, the goal is to fold this up so that the part of the front that you see that's been turned to the back is the same size. And I'm eyeballing it. You can certainly be more obsessive about that than I am. I mean, I have occasionally needed to take out stitching and redo it because it wasn't straight enough to suit me. But in general, I'm pretty good at this point at just doing it by eyeballing it. And that's why it's so important to make sure that you had the fabric cut square to begin with, because at this stage it'll goof you up. I'm going to pin this, and you can see even though I had felt and I'm turning, so when I'm turning here, I'm turning the felt edge and the fabric edge, and I'm not having any trouble with it. It's not going to be too bulky. So unless the top of the piece that you're making or that you're backing is really heavy fabric of some kind, you shouldn't have too much trouble trimming it. Although recently a friend of mine, Jill Robinson, experimented with this, and she cut the felt smaller than the fabric when she fused it together, and then she could fold the fabric over the felt. But I haven't needed to do that at this point, so I'm not going to change what works for me. Now the felt I'm using is referred to as craft felt. It's a polyester product. I buy it online at Joann Fabrics in the United States, and it is somewhat heat resistant. So when I put the iron down on it the way I am and I'm pressing, I'm not getting felt melting onto my iron, but you need to be careful yourself based on the kind of felt that you choose to use. I'm going to turn this around again so I can get this corner on the camera. And then I'm going to trim this as well. And then I'm going to turn it over and look at it to make sure it's straight. Now see, there's a little bit of a wave right here. And now's the time to fix that. And it's easy enough to fix by turning it over and pushing it back up in there a little bit so that it's even. Better to do that now instead of after the fact when you've already stitched it in place. Okay, I put another pin in there. And now I'm ready to stitch this in place. Okay, so I'm using a dual duty all-purpose charcoal colored thread that matches my fabric. I'm using a needle that's called a between. It's a very small needle. It's traditionally used for quilting. If you want to use a slightly bigger needle, that's no big deal. Okay, so I'm using a single strand. Let's see if you can see that. And I've got a knot in the end. And first I'm going to run it up inside. So I come up right there. And I make my first stitch into the felt only to anchor it. Now here's the trick to this. I'm going to slide the needle through the felt, but it's never going all the way to the front. And I'm going to keep these stitches pretty small. So I slide the needle through the felt and then I pick up the edge of the binding. Slide the needle through the felt, pick up the edge of the binding. Now you could do this stitch so that all the threads are on top of the felt, but this is a really cleaner, more professional looking way to do the stitching. And I usually have a longer thread so the needle doesn't come unthreaded. All right, so you don't want to pull too tight because then it would pucker, and you can just pull those pins out as you go along. So I'm keeping one finger underneath. I don't need a thimble because the needle isn't actually penetrating the fabric, but it helps me lift the fabric a little bit so that I can make sure the needle stays under the felt without going through to the front. Now this is a much cleaner way to do a finish than, for example, machine stitching along here. You could do that, but then of course you'd have a border of thread all the way around, and if it wasn't really nice and straight, it could really be a distraction. So I'm going to continue stitching this until I get all the way over to the other end, and then I'm going to stop and knot it off, and then I'll show you how to do the strip where you have to turn the corner in. Okay, so I've stitched the edge here exactly the same way I showed you just a little bit ago, but now I'm to a corner where the two facings are going to overlap. And this is how I handle it. There are other ways that other people do it, but this is fairly straightforward. It's easy and it looks great. So I'm going to clip just a little bit of that corner, and then I'm going to fold in this edge, which is why I don't cut this one off this time. And then I'm going to do exactly what I did before. I'm just going to fold this up. And you can angle this just a little bit more so that it aligns with that edge. And you will press and pin just like I did when I was doing the long side. Okay, so you can see that when I turn this over, I'm going to have a nice square corner. And when I finish the facing all the way around, I'll have 4 nice sharp corners. And then I'm ready to go on to the preparation of the aluminum rod that I use, flat piece of aluminum that becomes the hanging device. And I'll show you that next. Okay, now I want to share something that I feel is a really great invention, one of the best things I ever thought of. This is a flat aluminum bar, and you can buy them at a big box store like Lowe's or Home Depot in the United States. And they come in different lengths, so you may have to cut it, and I'll tell you how to do that in a minute. But this is basically what I use is 1 inch this way, and it's a 1/4 inch thick, okay? And off camera, we used a hacksaw. So you put the bar in a C-clamp on the table and use a hacksaw to trim it up, and then you take a piece of sanding block and smooth out the edge a little bit so it isn't sharp, and then you can drill a hole, and this hole is big enough that a small nail will fit on it so it can actually be mounted on the wall, or it could have fishing line through that hole so that the piece could be suspended from the ceiling. So it's very lightweight. So if you're sending a piece of artwork somewhere for an exhibition, it's a great choice. You don't want to get the real heavy iron stuff because they make that and they sell it in the same location. Make sure you go for the aluminum. Now, here is the beautiful thing about this. You can buy Velcro, and you can buy the side of the Velcro that is the hook side. That's the real stiff part of it. And obviously, I do this a lot because I got a whomping big old thing of Velcro. You don't have to buy that much. But the idea, I'm going to turn the quilt out of the way right here so it doesn't stick to the Velcro. I'm going to cut a piece. Oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you this. When you measure how wide you want this aluminum to be, you want to give yourself about 1/2 inch on either end. So it doesn't need to go all the way to the end of the piece in order to be long enough. Because if you make it too long, then you run the risk of it showing, and that wouldn't look professional. So make it a little bit shorter. Okay, now back to the Velcro. This is a Velcro that is industrial strength, and it has has a really sticky back, and then this clear stuff. So I'm going to cut the Velcro so that it's the distance between the two holes that were drilled in the aluminum. And then I'm going to position the Velcro, and you see that I'm not taking the plastic off of the whole piece because this is really, really sticky, and if it sticks to something else, you might have a mess on your hands. So I hope you can see that. I'm pulling this off as I go and using my other hand to smooth down the Velcro so that it's nice and flat on the aluminum. Okay. So that is almost instantaneously adhered to the aluminum. And the beautiful thing is, let's see, I haven't finished stitching this all the way around yet, but when I'm finished, this is the top, I can just position this on the felt and it's permanent. I mean, it's not permanent, you can pull it off, but it won't fall off the wall. It's very stable that way. So you can see, since I don't have Velcro all the way to this hole in the end, I can put the fishing line through there, or I can put this on the wall and fold it back, and it will be totally obscured and the piece won't come off. But later, if I want to take the piece off, it's easy. I can just take it off to store it, or I can take it off. Sometimes you make a quilt and it requires a sleeve because that's what the rules of the competition are. And if that was true, then you could always take this method off. You could create a sleeve, and you could literally use this inside that sleeve instead if you'd prefer to do it that way. And if you were finishing any piece that didn't have felt on the back, that was regular like quilter's cotton or regular back, the way most people work with their quilts, if you don't have the felt, the Velcro won't work, but the aluminum is still a really beautiful choice for being inside the sleeve because it's so thin and it's so sturdy, it won't bow, and it also won't warp, and it's very lightweight. So that makes it a really great choice, whether it's going to go into a sleeve in the traditional way or adhere to the felt as I did right here. Okay, so beautiful way to finish your work, and makes it look very professional, nice square corners, hangs nice and flat. You could put a piece of aluminum at the top and the bottom if you wanted to, in order to make sure it hung really nice and straight on the wall. It's easy to do, it's very inexpensive, and I hope you'll give it a try.